Frost clings to the hardened mud of the lane, shimmering like crushed glass in the pale, hesitant pre-dawn light. The wind carries the sharp bite of salt and pine, dragging off the Atlantic to rattle the wooden shutters of the settlement. The scent of wood smoke and damp wool hangs heavy, a testament to the fires kept alive through a bitter New England night. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If these quiet histories bring you comfort, you're always welcome to return by subscribing. You open your eyes to a darkness that feels absolute. The air inside your small timber-framed cottage biting at your exposed cheeks. The thick wool blankets offer a heavy, familiar comfort, but the hearth has burned down to nothing more than a few sullen, glowing embers. You push the covers aside, your bare feet meeting the freezing, swept dirt of the floorboards. The sudden shock of the cold travels up your legs, waking you fully as you reach blindly for your woolen shift. This is the year 1666, and survival on the edge of this Puritan town demands rising long before the sun has even considered breaking the horizon. You know this routine intimately, moving through the cramped space by memory alone. Beyond the rough-hewn walls, the forest presses close, a towering wall of dark timber that the townspeople view with a mixture of necessity and profound suspicion. Somewhere, an owl calls out, a low and mournful sound that seems to echo from miles across the frozen canopy. The settlement itself remains completely silent, locked in the deep, pious quiet of a community that fears the unforgiving dark. Even the dogs are completely still, curled tightly against the wind that slips between the cracks of the wooden palisade. Morning is coming, but for now, the world belongs entirely to the shadows and the creeping frost. You kneel before the stone hearth, your breath pluming in small, white clouds that quickly vanish into the gloom. Your hands, calloused and stained with the faint, lingering green of crushed herbs, arrange dry pine needles and kindling over the dying coals. You blow softly, a steady, measured breath that coaxes a fragile ribbon of orange flame to life. The fire catches the pitch-heavy wood, snapping loudly and casting a warm, flickering glow across the bundled plants hanging from the low rafters. You add larger pieces of split oak, watching the fire grow into a robust, comforting presence that pushes the chill back into the corners. The heat begins to seep into your bones, a daily resurrection that feels earned rather than given. Illumination from the growing fire reveals dozens of dried bundles swaying gently in the rising thermal currents, casting strange, spindly shadows across the ceiling. Yarrow hangs waiting for winter fevers, alongside willow bark for the ache of overused joints, and mint that smells sharply of the fleeting summer. A heavy cast iron pot sits ready on the trammel hook, its blackened sides coated in a layer of permanent soot from 1,000 previous mornings. The small wooden table holds a mortar and pestle carved from dense hickory, smooth and polished from years of relentless grinding. These are the tools of a trade that the town relies upon, yet eyes with a quiet, lingering mistrust. You pull your heavy woolen bodice tight, lacing it with practiced, numb fingers until it sits securely against your ribs. Your dark skirt, woven from coarse, sturdy yarn, falls heavily to your ankles, practical and entirely lacking in the vanity the ministers preach so vehemently against. You tie a simple linen coif over your hair, hiding the silver strands that have begun to outnumber the brown. You step into leather shoes that have grown stiff in the overnight freeze, forcing your heels down until the material finally yields. Every layer is a defense against the unforgiving New England winter, a practical armor worn by everyone who lives this far from the comforts of the old world. You tie a heavy apron around your waist, the fabric stained with the ghost of 100 different roots and berries. Somewhere a distant rooster finally shatters the quiet, a ragged, triumphant cry that carries clearly across the frost-hardened fields. Slowly, the settlement begins to stir, announcing its awakening through the dull thud of heavy wooden doors and the faint clatter of iron buckets. Smoke starts to rise from a dozen different chimneys, thin gray pillars that struggle upward against the heavy, oppressive sky. The distant sound of an axe biting into frozen wood echoes rhythmically, marking the beginning of the endless labor required to keep the town alive. Dawn is no longer a promise, but a creeping reality, painting the eastern horizon in bruised shades of violet and pale, watery gold. You lift your wooden bucket by its rope handle, the coarse hemp biting familiarly into your palm as you push open your heavy front door. The icy air hits you like a physical blow, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of boiled cabbage and distant livestock. You step onto the frozen path, your shoes crunching loudly against the crystallized earth as you make your way toward the communal well at the edge of the square. The walk is brief but biting, the wind tearing at the edges of your shawl and threatening to steal the warmth you just gathered by the hearth. You reach the stone perimeter of the well, noticing the thick layer of ice that has formed over the spilled water from the day before. Goodwife Miller stands already at the perimeter, her face pinched tightly against the cold, her breath a continuous stream of white vapor. She nods tightly in your direction, a greeting that lacks warmth, but acknowledges the shared misery of the freezing morning. Her hands are raw and red as she hauls her own bucket upward, the wooden crank groaning in protest against the ice. There is a careful distance maintained between the two of you, a gap born of your status as an unmarried woman of 40, living alone on the forest's edge. She fears your solitude almost as much as she relies on the teas you brew for her husband's chronic winter cough. You wait patiently for her to finish, keeping your eyes on the worn stones rather than forcing a conversation neither of you wants. You hook your bucket to the long rope and let it drop into the dark, echoing shaft, listening for the distant, satisfying splash. You grip the crank in turn, the muscles in your back and shoulders protesting the heavy, dead weight of the water. Hand over hand, you guide the dripping bucket back to the surface, the water inside sloshing violently and freezing almost instantly where it spills onto the stone. You unhook your prize, the bucket now immensely heavy, and balance it carefully as you turn back toward your small, isolated cottage. You gaze at the town, fully visible now in the gray light, a tight cluster of steep-roofed houses huddled together as if seeking collective warmth. The meeting house dominates the center square, a severe, unadorned structure that serves as both the spiritual and literal fortress of the community. Mud-rutted lanes wind between the homes, currently locked in frozen peaks and valleys that threaten to twist an unwary ankle. Men in dark, heavy coats are beginning to move toward the livestock pens, their breath mingling with the steam rising from the agitated animals. It is a place built on strict order and immense labor, where any deviation from the norm is viewed as a crack in the town's defensive walls. You cross the threshold of your home, grateful to shut the heavy door against the biting wind and the judging eyes of the settlement. You pour a measure of the freezing water into the iron pot, swinging the trammel back so the vessel rests directly over the dancing flames. You slice a thick piece of dense, dark rye bread from a loaf baked 3 days prior, the crust requiring significant force to breach. You place the bread on a wooden trencher, adding a small scraping of hard, salty butter that you traded a jar of elderberry syrup for last week. You stand close to the fire as you eat, the simple, rugged food providing the immediate energy required to face the unforgiving day ahead. Steam begins to rise from the iron pot, a low, vibrating hum that slowly builds into a rolling boil, sending warm, welcome moisture into the frigid room. The frost on the inside of the single small glass window begins to melt, weeping slow, clear trails down the thick, uneven panes. The cottage, though small and sparsely furnished, feels incredibly safe, a private sanctuary completely divorced from the rigid expectations of the meeting house. The scent of the burning oak completely overpowers the lingering chill, creating an invisible barrier against the harsh realities of the New England winter. This isolation is a choice, a carefully cultivated existence that offers unparalleled freedom at the cost of constant, quiet suspicion. You fetch a bundle of dried comfrey from a wooden peg, the brittle leaves rustling dryly against each other in your grasp. You crush the foliage between your palms, letting the coarse fragments fall into a small ceramic bowl waiting on the table. You pour a ladle of the boiling water over the crushed herbs, watching the liquid instantly turn a deep, muddy green as the potent oils are released. You breathe in the earthy, slightly bitter aroma, a smell that immediately grounds you and focuses your mind on the tasks of the day. You are the woman they come to when the prayers fail to break a fever, the unmarried healer who knows the secrets of the woods they fear. Decades ago, a woman living alone and practicing such arts might have faced the terrible, swift judgment of a magistrate's court. The shadow of those earlier, darker times still clings to the edges of the community, a residual paranoia that requires careful navigation. A single woman in her 40s is an anomaly, a loose thread in a society that believes every woman must be anchored to a husband or a father. To survive, one must be indispensable but entirely unobtrusive, offering vital cures while maintaining a demeanor of absolute, humble piety. The balance is exhausting, a daily performance of lowered eyes and quiet deference that hides a fiercely independent spirit. You wrap the steeping bowl in a thick layer of felted wool to keep it warm, placing it carefully into a woven ash splint basket. You add a small tin of salve made from rendered tallow and calendula, pressing the lid down firmly to secure it against the journey. You drape a heavy woolen cloak over your shoulders, pulling the deep hood up to shield your face from the biting coastal wind. You grasp your walking stick, a stout length of polished hickory that has accompanied you on 1,000 similar errands across the rocky terrain. You step out into the morning once more, pulling the door tightly shut behind you and dropping the iron latch into place with a definitive clack. Morning light finally breaks the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the snow-dusted fields that surround the tight cluster of homes. The light is blindingly bright, but offers absolutely no warmth, merely illuminating the harsh, unyielding landscape of the frontier. Crows call harshly from the bare branches of an ancient elm, their black shapes stark against the pale, washed-out blue of the winter sky. A cart rumbles past on the frozen mud, the oxen straining against the wooden yoke, their driver wrapped so thickly in wool he appears entirely shapeless. The entire settlement is locked in a desperate, daily struggle against the elements, a fight that leaves little room for joy or idle conversation. You walk toward the eastern edge of the village, your boots finding the easiest path through the frozen ruts by long practiced habit. You arrive at a small, weather-beaten cottage where the chimney smoke is dangerously thin, a sure sign that illness has disrupted the household's crucial routines. You knock 3 times on the heavy oak door, the sound muffled by your thick woolen mittens against the rough timber. You hear a weak, shuffling footstep approach from inside, followed by the slow, painful scraping of a wooden bar being lifted from its iron brackets. You wait patiently, knowing that the fear of the wilderness extends even to a familiar face appearing at the door so early in the day. You watch as the door opens to reveal a young mother, her face pale and drawn tight with exhaustion, holding a bundled infant tightly against her chest. The interior of the cottage is terribly cold, the fire having burned down to a meager pile of ash due to a lack of tending. A young boy lies on a straw pallet near the hearth, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin flushed with an unnatural, feverish heat. The room smells of stale sweat and profound fear, a suffocating atmosphere that often accompanies the arrival of the winter sickness. Desperation hangs in the air, a silent plea directed at the unmarried woman they usually pretend not to see during Sunday services. You step inside without waiting for a formal invitation, instantly dropping your heavy basket onto the rough-hewn table. You move directly to the hearth, utilizing the kindling you brought in your own pockets to swiftly coax the dying fire back into a roaring blaze. You unpack the warm comfrey infusion, instructing the exhausted mother to prop the child up so he might drink the bitter healing liquid. You place a cool, damp cloth against the boy's burning forehead, your touch gentle but entirely professional, radiating a calm authority that immediately settles the panicked room. You spend the next hour locked in a quiet battle against the fever, applying salves and forcing fluids until the child's breathing finally begins to slow and deepen. Silent tears fall from the mother's eyes in the corner, a release of tension that she would never dare display in the crowded, judgmental aisles of the meeting house. The fire is now burning hotly, pushing the dangerous chill out of the small room and bringing a faint flush of color back to the woman's pale cheeks. Payment is offered in the form of a small, tightly wrapped block of hard cheese and a dozen carefully preserved apples from the autumn harvest. It is a silent transaction, an exchange of survival for survival that requires no grand speeches or profound expressions of gratitude. The transaction is complete, leaving both parties slightly more equipped to face the relentless demands of the coming weeks. You return to the bright, freezing morning, your basket slightly heavier with the traded goods resting safely inside. You walk with a lighter step, the deep, bodily satisfaction of having broken a fever humming pleasantly in your veins. You nod to the blacksmith as you pass his forge, the ringing of his hammer against the anvil providing a steady, metallic heartbeat to the town. You ignore the lingering stares from a group of younger women carrying laundry toward the frozen creek, entirely accustomed to their whispered speculations. You are a solitary figure against the backdrop of a community obsessed with conformity, carving out a dangerous, vital space on the very edge of their world. You observe the village square bustling with necessary activity, a chaotic intersection of carts, barking dogs, and men shouting harsh commands to stubborn draft animals. The local magistrate stands on the steps of the meeting house, his severe black coat contrasting sharply with the pristine snow, watching the proceedings with an eagle's eye. A group of men are repairing a section of the wooden palisade, their axes biting into fresh pine with sharp, echoing cracks that bounce off the surrounding forest wall. Every motion in the settlement is purposeful, driven by the absolute necessity of maintaining the fragile barrier between civilization and the howling wilderness. There is no time for leisure, no space for idleness, only the endless, grinding work of staying alive. You enter your own quiet cottage, the silence inside greeting you like an old, immensely comforting friend. You unpack the cheese and the apples, storing them carefully in the small, stone-lined cellar pit beneath the floorboards to protect them from the freezing ambient air. You sit in the wooden chair beside the hearth, leaning your head back and allowing the accumulated tension of the morning to slowly drain from your shoulders. You trace the grain of the wooden table with a calloused finger, listening to the wind begin to pick up speed outside the thick timber walls. You have survived another morning, successfully navigating the treacherous waters of being an independent, unmarried woman in a society that fears exactly that. Illumination shifting through the small glass panes takes on a harder, whiter quality as the morning progresses toward midday. The frost on the glass has completely melted away, leaving the panes clear enough to reveal the stark, skeletal branches of the bordering woods. Inside, the fire has settled into a steady, reliable burn, consuming the oak logs with a quiet, persistent crackle that fills the empty space. Dust motes dance lazily in the single shaft of sunlight that pierces the gloom, illuminated briefly before vanishing back into the ambient shadows. The cottage feels entirely separate from the frantic, survival-driven energy of the village outside, a pocket of suspended time where the rules are dictated solely by the turning of the seasons. You gather a handful of dried roots from a burlap sack in the corner, bringing them to the table to begin the slow process of sorting and grading. You examine each piece carefully, discarding any that show signs of mold or rot, keeping only the firm, potent sections for your future tinctures. You reach for the heavy iron knife, its blade honed to a razor edge, and begin slicing the tough roots into small, manageable fragments. You fall into a mesmerizing, repetitive rhythm, the rhythmic thwack of the blade against the wooden board becoming a meditative chant. You are entirely absorbed in the work, your mind quiet, your hands executing tasks they have known intimately for more than 2 decades. Outsiders might view this level of solitude as crushing, a terrible, lonely exile imposed by a rigid, unforgiving society. The reality, however, is far more complex. A carefully balanced existence where isolation is the exact price paid for a precious, rare autonomy. There are no husbands demanding meals, no crying children requiring constant vigilance, no masters dictating the hours of the day. The silence of the cottage is not empty. It is filled with the profound weight of self-determination, a quiet rebellion maintained through absolute necessity. It is a life built on the very margins, existing in the gray area between the indispensable healer and the suspected outcast. You sweep the chopped roots into a glass jar, pouring a measure of strong, clear spirit over them to begin the long extraction process. You seal the jar tightly with a piece of oiled leather and a length of twine, setting it on a high shelf where the ambient heat of the room will coax the medicine from the wood. You wipe down the table with a damp cloth, removing the dust and debris to leave the surface immaculate and ready for the next task. You pause to stretch your back, pressing your hands against your lower spine and leaning backward until the joints pop in, satisfying succession. You breathe deeply, the scent of the alcohol and the earthy roots mingling pleasantly in the warm, enclosed air. Midday approaches as the shadow on the sundial in the square creeps forward, signaling the brief, mandatory pausing of labor. The ringing of the blacksmith's hammer finally ceases, leaving a ringing void in the air that is quickly filled by the low murmur of voices and the clatter of wooden bowls. The village seems to exhale collectively, a temporary halting of the machinery of survival to allow for the consumption of dense, heavy meals. The wind has died down completely, leaving the settlement locked in a still, frozen tableau beneath a glaring, pale sky. Morning is ending, giving way to the bright, unforgiving clarity of the winter midday. You step back out into the bright, unforgiving clarity of the winter midday, pulling your heavy cloak tighter against the biting gusts that sweep across the cleared fields. The settlement sits exposed under the pale, towering sky, a fragile collection of wooden boxes huddled against the vastness of the untamed continent. You carry a sturdy woven basket and a small, curved iron knife. Your destination, not the bustling center of town, but the dark, imposing tree line that marks the boundary of their ordered world. This is the time to gather white pine bark and the last of the hardened resin, materials essential for sealing salves and treating the deep chest colds that plague the congregation. The snow crunches loudly beneath your stiff leather boots, a rhythmic sound that momentarily drowns out the distant, muffled voices of men returning to their intense afternoon labor. The forest edge looms ahead like a solid wall of iron and shadow, the ancient pines standing shoulder to shoulder in silent, towering judgment. You cross the boundary line where the cleared stumps give way to undisturbed undergrowth, immediately feeling the sharp drop in temperature as the canopy blocks the sun. The air here smells intensely of pitch and decaying leaves, a rich, feral scent that stands in stark contrast to the wood smoke and boiled pottage of the village. You run your bare fingers over the rough, deeply fissured bark of a massive pine, feeling the sharp edges of the dried resin that has bled from a frozen wound. The forest does not care about the magistrate's laws or the minister's sermons, operating on an ancient and different cycle of growth and decay that you have spent a lifetime learning to navigate. You pry a large amber-colored globule of resin loose with the tip of your iron knife, catching the brittle shard before it vanishes into the deep snow. It takes considerable effort to work the blade under the frozen sap, your knuckles scraping against the unyielding bark until they are raw and red. You drop the precious material into your woven basket, the resin clattering sharply against the woven ash splints with a hollow, satisfying thud. This hardened pitch, when melted with beeswax and tallow, forms a waterproof barrier that protects cracked hands from the agonizing pain of winter labor. You move methodically from tree to tree, reading the trunks like the pages of a deeply familiar wordless book, seeking the specific wounds that yield the best medicine. Silence deepens the further you venture into the trees, the sounds of the Puritan settlement fading into a dull, indistinguishable hum behind you. A sudden snapping of a branch overhead breaks the stillness, sending a shower of fine, powdery snow cascading down onto your woolen hood. You pause, perfectly motionless, watching a large gray squirrel navigate the upper branches with frantic, desperate energy, foraging for hidden caches of acorns. The wilderness holds terrors for the townspeople, hiding perceived demons and very real threats within its dense, impenetrable depths, making them cling fiercely to their cleared acres. For you, however, this timbered expanse is a necessary larder, a place of quiet provision where the complex, unwritten rules of the natural world supersede the rigid doctrines of the meeting house. You kneel beside a fallen birch tree, brushing away a thick layer of snow to expose the papery, peeling bark that clings to the decaying wood. You slice carefully, taking only the outermost layers, ensuring the strips are long and intact, perfect for wrapping poultices or brewing a mild, fever-reducing tea. The cold seeps quickly through the knees of your woolen skirt, an icy dampness that serves as a harsh reminder not to linger too long in the shadows. You work with a practiced, efficient speed, packing the birch bark securely beside the pine resin, knowing the afternoon light will soon begin its rapid, inevitable decline. Your breath forms a constant, rhythmic cloud of white vapor, mingling with the sharp, clean scent of the disturbed snow and the pungent earth beneath. You rise and turn back toward the pale light filtering through the trees, the basket now resting heavily against your hip with the weight of the afternoon's harvest. The return journey always feels slightly longer, the encroaching shadows stretching out to pull at your skirts, urging you to hurry back to the safety of the hearth. You break through the tree line, and the glaring brightness of the snow-covered fields momentarily blinds you, forcing you to squint against the harsh, reflected sunlight. The village sits exactly as you left it, a tight defensive cluster of steeply pitched roofs venting robust, patient columns of gray smoke into the freezing air. You adjust your grip on the basket handle, setting your jaw as you prepare to re-enter the structured, scrutinizing gaze of your neighbors. Midday labor resumes with a sudden coordinated intensity across the settlement, the brief respite of the meal giving way to the relentless demands of the short winter afternoon. The rhythmic thud of the blacksmith's hammer returns, joining the harsh scraping sound of a cross-cut saw biting through thick timber near the meeting house. Women wrapped tightly in dark shawls move quickly between the outbuildings, carrying buckets of feed or bundles of stiff, frozen laundry that clatter like boards. The air is thick with the smell of rendering fat and burning hardwood, an industrial, survival-focused aroma that completely masks the subtle sense of the forest you just left. Every resident is a crucial cog in this isolated machine, their individual desires entirely subsumed by the desperate collective need to simply endure until the spring thaw. You angle your path toward the communal storehouse, a massive, blocky structure built of heavy logs that sits heavily near the center of the village square. The snow in the square has been trampled into a hard, slippery sheet of dirty ice by hundreds of boots, requiring careful, deliberate placement of every single step. You need a small measure of salt, a precious commodity imported from across the ocean to properly preserve the roots you chopped earlier in the morning. You approach the heavy double doors, noting the armed watchman who stands nearby, his musket resting casually against his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon with dull, practiced vigilance. You nod respectfully to him, maintaining the required demeanor of unassuming obedience that allows you to move freely within this heavily guarded space. You push open the heavy oak door, leaning your entire body weight against the iron handle until the hinges groan and yield to your effort. The interior of the storehouse is cavernous and incredibly dark, smelling overwhelmingly of cured tobacco, salted cod, and the dusty dry scent of stored grain. Master Higgins, the keeper of the stores, stands behind a high wooden counter, a large ledger open before him, his quill scratching loudly in the sudden, echoing silence. He is a severe man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that constantly calculate, evaluating every person who crosses his threshold against their debts and their perceived piety. You approach the counter, setting your basket down softly, waiting for him to acknowledge your presence rather than presuming to interrupt his meticulous accounting. Pages rustle dryly as he turns a leaf in the heavy ledger, his gaze finally lifting to meet yours, with a look of mild, calculated impatience. He does not offer a greeting, merely raising a single bushy eyebrow, waiting for you to state your business in the fewest words possible. The storehouse represents the absolute authority of the town council, controlling the distribution of the very calories that keep the settlement alive through the deepest freezes. You state your need for salt, offering 2 small, tightly stoppered vials of concentrated willow bark extract in exchange, a remedy you know his wife desperately requires for her joint pain. He inspects the vials carefully, turning them over in his stained fingers, his face betraying absolutely no emotion as he weighs the value of the trade. You watch him retrieve a heavy wooden scoop, plunging it into a large burlap sack and withdrawing a modest pile of coarse gray sea salt. He pours it expertly into the small linen bag you provided, the crystals rasping loudly against the cloth, securing the trade without a single word of confirmation or gratitude. You tie the bag shut, the salt heavy and dense in your palm, representing weeks of preservation power for your medicinal supplies. You tuck the vials onto a shelf behind him, accepting the silent transaction as a profound victory in a world where your currency is skill rather than silver. You offer a slight, respectful bow of your head, turning away from the counter and making your way back toward the sliver of pale light seeping through the cracked door. You step out of the storehouse just as a large, horse-drawn sledge, heavily loaded with freshly felled timber, arrives in the square, the massive draft animals blowing great clouds of steam. The driver shouts hoarsely, cracking a long leather whip over their heads, urging them forward toward the saw pit where 2 men wait with a long, vicious-looking 2-handed blade. You press yourself against the rough log wall of the storehouse to let the immense, creaking conveyance pass, feeling the ground tremble slightly beneath the incredible weight of the wood. The scent of fresh pine sap fills the air, sharp and cleanly cutting through the pervasive smells of wood smoke and unwashed wool. You watch the men begin the grueling process of wrestling the massive logs into position, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they fight against the unyielding, frozen timber. Shadows begin to lengthen dramatically across the trampled snow of the square, stretching eastward like long, dark fingers reaching toward the surrounding forest. The pale winter sun is already beginning its early descent, casting a cold amber light that illuminates the harsh angles of the rooftops and the deep ruts in the road. The temperature, which had stabilized briefly during the midday hours, immediately begins to plummet, bringing a fresh, biting edge to the wind that whips around the corners of the meeting house. The brief window of usable daylight is closing fast, accelerating the pace of the villagers as they rush to complete their outdoor chores before the perilous dark returns. The harsh reality of 1666 dictates that the night belongs to the cold, the wolves, and the unseen fears that populate the Puritan imagination. You pull your cloak tightly around your throat, burying your chin in the rough wool, and begin the walk back to your cottage on the fringe of the settlement. You pass the minister's house, a larger, two-story structure with actual glass windows, where a faint, warm glow is already beginning to build behind the panes. You catch a glimpse of his wife moving past the glass, her posture rigid, her head bowed in what might be prayer, or simply the exhaustion of maintaining the town's highest moral standard. You feel a sudden, sharp pang of complicated emotion, not quite envy, but a profound awareness of the vast, unbridgeable gulf between her heavily scrutinized life and your own solitary existence. You quicken your pace, the salt in the forest gatherings heavy in your basket, eager to return to the sanctuary of your own four walls. You reach your sturdy oak door, the iron latch freezing cold against your bare fingers as you lift it and push the heavy timber inward. The cottage welcomes you with a profound, enveloping warmth, the fire having burned down to a beautiful, pulsing bed of cherry-red coals that radiate intense heat. You secure the door behind you, dropping the heavy wooden bar into its iron brackets with a solid, satisfying thud that officially locks the settlement and its judgments outside. You set your basket on the table, immediately feeling the tension in your shoulders uncoil in the dim, private quiet of your own space. This small, dark room is your entire domain, a fiercely defended territory where you answer to no magistrate, no husband, and no minister, ruling over your dried herbs and iron pots with absolute sovereignty. The iron kettle still hangs over the coals, the water inside completely motionless but radiating a gentle, ambient warmth into the surrounding air. You add 3 small pieces of split birch to the embers, watching the papery bark instantly curl and ignite with a bright, cheerful flare that pushes the gathering twilight back into the corners. The dancing light reveals the meticulous order of your home, the carefully swept dirt floor, the neat bundles of drying plants, the single wooden chair pulled close to the hearth. It is a life stripped of all luxury, reduced to the absolute essentials of survival and the slow, methodical work of healing. Yet, within these severe constraints, you have carved out a space of profound independence, a dangerous and triumphant reality in a century that demands total submission from its women. You unpack the salt and the pine resin, arranging the items precisely on the smooth wooden table, readying them for the evening's work. You pour a small cup of weak cider from a clay jug, the liquid cold and slightly sour, stinging your throat pleasantly as you drink. You sit heavily in your chair, extending your frozen feet toward the growing flames, relishing the painful prickle of returning circulation in your toes. The afternoon has shifted fully into the early stages of dusk, the light outside your single window fading from pale amber to a deep, bruised gray. You listen to the wind rattling the wooden shingles overhead, completely secure in the knowledge that you have gathered what you need to face whatever ailments tomorrow might bring. You retrieve the jar of chopped roots from the high shelf, giving it a firm, deliberate shake to ensure the clear spirit thoroughly coats the bitter fragments. The liquid has already begun to take on a faint, yellowish tinge, the potent medicinal compounds leaching slowly into the alcohol through the steady application of time and ambient heat. You set it back in its place, your eyes scanning the rows of similar jars and tightly bound pouches that line the upper walls of your small home. These preparations are your true wealth, far more valuable than the brittle paper money or heavy silver coins hoarded by the merchants in the larger coastal cities. You know exactly which mixture will soothe a colicky infant, which will draw the heat from an infected wound, and which will quiet the terrifying, rattling coughs that sweep through the village every January. Dusk thickens the air inside the cottage, blurring the sharp outlines of the furniture and turning the hanging bundles of herbs into strange, looming silhouettes against the ceiling. The fire is now the primary source of light, casting a vibrant, shifting orange glow that paints the rough timber walls in warm, flickering tones. Outside, the sounds of the village have diminished drastically, the shouts of the working men replaced by the lowing of cattle settling into their pens and the sharp bark of a dog warding off the encroaching dark. The deep, penetrating cold of the New England night begins to press against the exterior walls, seeking any crack in the mud chinking to slip its icy fingers into the room. The transition from day to night in this era is not a gentle fading, but a severe, sudden closing of the world, enforcing a strict boundary on human activity. You unlace your heavy boots, your fingers working clumsily at the stiff leather ties, finally kicking the frozen footwear aside with a sigh of profound relief. You step onto a small, braided rug positioned directly before the hearth, the thick wool providing a luxurious, warm barrier against the freezing dirt floor. You pull a large cast-iron skillet from its hook, setting it squarely over the hottest section of the fire, watching the metal begin to smoke faintly as the residual grease heats up. You slice a thick piece of salted pork from a slab hanging in the cold cellar. The meat tough and heavily preserved, dropping it into the hot skillet with a loud, aggressive sizzle. The rich, heavy smell of frying fat instantly fills the small room, a dense, caloric aroma that signals the end of the day's physical labor and the beginning of the evening's restoration. You add a handful of dried peas and a roughly chopped turnip to the skillet, stirring the mixture with a long wooden spoon, scraping the browned bits of pork from the bottom of the iron pan. The food is simple, monotonous, and aggressively plain, reflecting the harsh realities of the agricultural cycle and the austere culinary philosophy of the Puritan settlers. You do not miss the varied spices or delicate pastries of the Old World, having long ago adapted your palate to the robust, earthy flavors of survival. You watch the turnips soften in the bubbling fat, your mind drifting back to the pale face of the feverish boy you treated that morning, silently willing the comfrey to do its necessary work. You are intimately connected to the physical suffering of the town, bearing witness to their vulnerabilities in a way the aloof, thundering ministers never could. Wind begins to howl in earnest around the eaves of the cottage, a high, lonely sound that emphasizes the profound isolation of the settlement on the edge of the continent. The heavy wooden shutters rattle against their iron latches, a persistent, rhythmic tapping that sounds almost like a desperate hand seeking entry from the freezing dark. The temperature drops precipitously, forcing the frost to creep back across the bottom edges of the window panes, building thick, fern-like patterns of ice against the glass. The fire requires constant feeding now, devouring the split oak logs at an alarming rate just to maintain the perimeter of warmth within the small single room. It is a siege condition, a nightly battle against an environment that actively seeks to extinguish the fragile sparks of human existence huddled along the coast. You lift the heavy skillet from the fire using a thick, folded rag, carrying it carefully to the wooden table and setting it down on a protective iron trivet. You dish the steaming, oily mixture onto a wooden trencher, the smell of the salted pork and earthy turnips making your stomach rumble with deep, neglected hunger. You sit alone in the flickering light, eating methodically, savoring the intense, salty flavor and the immediate, comforting heat that spreads through your chest with each bite. There is no conversation to make, no family to serve, no husband to defer to, only the profound, silent satisfaction of a meal earned through your own relentless, independent labor. You chew a tough piece of pork, staring into the dancing flames, completely at peace with the solitary shape your life has taken in this unforgiving year. You finish the last of the meal, wiping the grease from the wooden trencher with a small crust of hard rye bread, ensuring not a single calorie is wasted. You rise and carry the dishes to a small wooden bucket near the door, pouring a splash of warm water over them to soak before the morning scrubbing. You retrieve a single, thick tallow candle from a wooden box, pressing the base firmly into an iron holder and lighting the wick with a long splinter of burning wood from the hearth. The flame sputters violently for a moment, sending a thick curl of black smoke toward the ceiling, before settling into a bright teardrop of yellowish light. You place the candle precisely in the center of the table, pulling a heavy, leather-bound journal and a small bottle of black ink toward you. Pages of the book are thick and rough, filled with dense, cramped handwriting that details the specific medicinal properties of local plants, weather patterns, and the outcomes of various treatments. This journal is highly dangerous, a detailed record of empirical observation that borders perilously close to the forbidden arts in the eyes of the more zealous townsfolk. You dip your quill into the dark ink, tapping the excess off on the rim of the glass bottle, pausing to collect your thoughts before committing them to the page. You write about the efficacy of the comfrey poultice on the boy's fever, noting the exact ratios used and the speed of his recovery, building a legacy of knowledge and absolute secrecy. The scratching of the nib against the coarse paper fills the quiet room, a small, defiant act of intellect and record-keeping in a world dominated by dogma. You write for nearly an hour, the candle burning down a full inch, the tallow dripping and pooling in waxy mounds at the base of the iron holder. You document the harvest of the white pine resin, noting the specific location of the trees and the quality of the sap retrieved from the frozen bark. You record the exchange rate at the storehouse, calculating the rising value of your herbal extracts against the dwindling communal supplies of salt and grain. Your handwriting is sharp, practical, and entirely legible, a stark contrast to the flowery, excessive scripts of the educated men back in England. You are charting the reality of the new world, creating a practical manual for survival that relies entirely on observation and experience rather than theology or superstition. You close the heavy leather cover of the journal, the sound a definitive thump in the stillness of the heavily insulated cottage. You clean the tip of the quill with a small rag, securing the ink bottle and returning both items to a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, concealing the evidence of your quiet scholarship. You lean back in the wooden chair, closing your eyes for just a moment to rest them from the strain of the flickering candlelight and the tiny, precise letters. The heat from the fire washes over your face, a dry, intense warmth that contrasts sharply with the drafts creeping across the swept dirt floor. The evening is deepening into the true, impenetrable dark of the winter night. The village completely locked down, the inhabitants huddled around their respective hearths, waiting for the dawn. Complete silence now reigns over the settlement, a vast, heavy stillness broken only by the sharp, occasional cracking of trees freezing solid in the distant forest. The pale moon has risen, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow-covered fields, illuminating the jagged palisade walls in stark, silvery relief against the black tree line. Inside the cottage, the fire continues its continuous dialogue of hiss and pop, the only companion you require in the deep, solitary hours of the evening. The air is thick with the smells of rendered pork, dried herbs, and melting tallow, a complex, intensely personal aroma that defines the boundaries of your independent existence. The day's labor has definitively ended, giving way to the restorative, contemplative atmosphere that belongs entirely to you. You stand up from the table, your joints popping lightly in protest after the long hours of walking, harvesting, and focused writing. You take the iron poker and carefully shift the remaining oak logs, breaking them down into a dense, glowing bed of embers that will hold their heat through the bitter hours ahead. You sweep the hearth with a small bundle of bound twigs, keeping the ash contained and the area meticulously clean, a habit born of a lifetime of strict self-reliance. You snuff the tallow candle with wet fingers, the sudden absence of the yellow flame plunging the room into the deep, shifting orange twilight of the banked fire. You stand in the center of the room, listening to the wind and the silence, entirely anchored in the harsh, beautiful reality of this specific year. You cross to the far corner of the room, pulling a heavy, woven woolen shawl from a wooden peg to drape over your shoulders against the growing chill of the night air. You sit on the edge of the low, straw-filled mattress, feeling the familiar, comforting crunch of the dried stalks shifting beneath your weight. You gaze into the glowing red heart of the fireplace, your mind replaying the intricate, dangerous, and utterly vital steps you took to navigate the rigid society outside your door today. You are a solitary woman in a frightened, isolated world, holding your ground with quiet defiance, iron-willed independence, and hands that know exactly how to heal. The night deepens around your small, sturdy cottage, the winter holding the continent in an iron grip, while you remain warm, watchful, and entirely unbroken. You sit on the edge of the mattress for a long time, listening to the deep, settling groans of the cottage timbers contracting in the bitter cold. The wind has shifted, driving hard from the north now, seeking out every minute weakness in the mud chinking between the thick oak logs. You pull the heavy woolen shawl tight around your shoulders, appreciating the coarse, practical warmth it provides against the invasive, icy drafts. The glowing embers of the hearth cast a very dim, blood-red light across the swept dirt floor, barely reaching the far corners of the room. You stand up slowly, your bare feet immediately registering the freezing temperature of the ground beyond the small, braided rug. The night has fully claimed the settlement, plunging the world into a state of absolute, profound darkness that terrifies the more pious members of the congregation. You know this darkness intimately, finding a strange, solitary comfort in the heavy blanket it throws over the judging, watchful eyes of the village. Outside the thick walls, the frozen world crackles and snaps with an eerie, unpredictable rhythm that demands constant, low-level vigilance. The ancient oaks and towering pines in the surrounding forest complain loudly against the plummeting temperatures, their frozen sap expanding and splitting the bark with sharp reports like distant musket fire. These specific sounds would send a shudder through the goodwives huddled in their beds, convinced that the devil himself was marching through the dark timberline. For you, it is merely the natural, indifferent language of the wilderness, enduring another brutal season of 17th-century New England. You cross the room to the small, frost-covered window, pressing your bare hand flat against the heavy wooden shutter that bars the night from your sanctuary. The cold radiates through the solid oak, a physical, aggressive pressure that reminds you just how fragile human existence is on this rocky, unforgiving coast. You check the heavy iron latch one more time, ensuring the bolt is thrown completely home for the incredibly long, dark hours ahead. You move back to the sturdy table, guided solely by the dull, pulsing light of the deeply banked coals in the fireplace. You run your hands over the smooth, worn surface of the wood, your fingertips easily locating the heavy iron knife you used earlier in the day. The blade requires constant, meticulous maintenance to prevent the damp, salty coastal air from pitting the precious metal with destructive, creeping rust. You retrieve a small, smooth whetstone from a leather pouch, spitting lightly on its flat surface to provide the necessary lubrication for the steel. You begin to draw the edge of the knife across the stone with slow, measured strokes, the rhythmic metallic scraping filling the painfully quiet room. You adjust the angle slightly by feel alone, your muscles remembering the precise geometry required to achieve a wicked, razor-sharp edge on the iron. The repetitive, necessary motion focuses your mind entirely on the present moment, stripping away the complex social anxieties of the daylight hours. Footsteps crunch suddenly in the frozen snow outside your door, a heavy, deliberate sound that instantly breaks the mesmerizing rhythm of your sharpening. The night watchman is making his required rounds, walking the treacherous perimeter of the wooden palisade to ensure no threats approach the sleeping town. You pause your work, holding the knife and the whetstone perfectly still, listening intently to his slow, methodical progress past your isolated cottage. He pauses near your window, perhaps checking the integrity of your closed shutters, or perhaps simply catching his breath in the freezing, wind-whipped air. You hear him stamp his heavy boots twice to drive the agonizing cold from his toes before continuing his lonely patrol toward the dark meeting house. The soft, crunching impacts of his passing fade slowly into the distance, leaving the silence of the cottage feeling even deeper and more profound than before. You resume your steady scraping strokes against the whetstone, reassured by the fragile but necessary perimeter of defense the solitary man represents. You wipe the freshly sharpened blade with a scrap of oiled linen, carefully removing the fine metal dust and coating the steel against the humid air. You test the refined edge gently with your thumb, feeling the microscopic and visible bite of the metal that confirms the tool is fully ready for tomorrow's labor. You place the knife back in its protective leather sheath, setting it deliberately beside the wooden trencher on the immaculately cleared table. You retrieve a large woven basket filled with dried kidney beans from the dark corner near the hearth, hauling it closer to the residual heat of the ashes. You plunge your hands deep into the dry, rattling seeds, the sound like a sudden, rushing waterfall in the otherwise completely silent room. You begin to sort them strictly by touch, picking out the shriveled or stony pieces that manage to hide during the frantic autumn winnowing. This tactile work requires no candlelight, relying entirely on the sensitive, calloused pads of your fingers to quickly distinguish between sustenance and debris. Time loses its rigid, imposed structure in these deep, solitary hours, detaching completely from the strict hourly dictates of the village bell. You measure the passage of the night solely by the gradual, creeping cooling of the room and the slow settling of the gray ash in the fireplace. The sorted beans clatter softly as you transfer the good ones into a smaller wooden bucket, building a reliable stockpile of calories for the brutal coming months. The monotonous, highly rhythmic task allows your thoughts to wander through the quiet, snow-covered lanes of the settlement, tracing the invisible connections you hold with the sleeping families. You know whose joints ache terribly when the barometric pressure drops, whose children suffer from the winter croup, and whose cellars are running dangerously low on preserved roots. You hold the physical vulnerabilities of this Puritan community securely in your hands, an unspoken, massive power that keeps you safe even as they view you with deep suspicion. The bucket fills steadily under your diligent, moving fingers, a tangible, heavy representation of your careful preparation and unwavering resilience. You fetch a thick, coarse skein of unspun wool from a wooden chest at the foot of your bed, bringing it back to the relative warmth of the hearth. The raw fleece still smells incredibly strongly of the sheep, a heavy, lanolin-rich scent that speaks of green pastures, now buried deep beneath the winter drifts. You sit heavily in your chair and begin the tedious, dusty process of teasing the tangled fibers apart, pulling the matted clumps into soft, airy clouds ready for the spinning wheel. Your hands work automatically, your thumbs and forefingers performing the delicate, repetitive pulling motions that separate the coarse scarred hairs from the fine, usable undercoat. You feel the natural oils of the unprocessed wool coating your skin, providing a soothing, deeply moisturizing barrier against the dry, cracking cold of the indoor air. The pile of processed fleece grows slowly on your woolen lap, a soft, yielding mass that contrasts sharply with the harsh, frozen realities of the year 1666. You find a deep, quiet satisfaction in successfully transforming the raw, chaotic material into something deeply ordered and fundamentally useful. You watch the embers closely as a sudden pocket of trapped gas ignites with a hollow pop, sending a brief, brilliant shower of tiny orange sparks up the soot-blackened chimney. The sudden flare illuminates the rough-hewn beams high above your head, throwing the drying bundles of yarrow and meadowsweet into sharp, dramatic relief for just a fraction of a second. You pause your careful carding, your eyes naturally following the upward trajectory of the sparks until they vanish into the dark, drawing your attention to the persistent howl of the wind across the roof. The thatched covering of the cottage is thick and incredibly well made, but the sheer force of the Atlantic gale tests every bound bundle of reeds, creating a continuous, low-pitched vibration in the walls. You pull your shawl tighter over your chest, tucking the fringed edges securely under your arms to trap the ambient heat tightly against your core. The The cold is a living, breathing entity tonight, pressing relentlessly against the mud chinking, actively seeking any minor vulnerability to exploit. You simply lower your head and return to the wool, entirely accustomed to the perpetual state of siege this brutal season demands. You gather the fluffy, teased wool into a large, loose bundle, securing it carefully with a length of rough hemp twine to prevent it from tangling again. You place the prepared fleece back into the heavy wooden chest, the thick oak lid closing with a dull, resonant thump that briefly echoes loudly in the small space. You walk back to the water bucket near the door, forcefully breaking the thin, fragile layer of ice that has already formed on the surface since you last disturbed it. You dip a small tin cup into the freezing water, lifting it quickly to your lips and drinking deeply, the shocking cold forcing a sharp, involuntary gasp from your lungs. The icy liquid jolts your entire system, instantly clearing the pleasant, lethargic haze that the repetitive work and the residual heat of the fire had slowly begun to induce. You wipe your mouth with the back of your hand, feeling the chill linger heavily in your chest, a sharp reminder of the lethal environment waiting just beyond the sturdy timber walls. You set the cup down carefully, the metal clinking softly against the wooden rim of the bucket with a bright, solitary sound. Shadows stretch and distort bizarrely across the room as the embers continue their slow, inevitable decay, the red glow contracting inward toward the very center of the stone hearth. The temperature in the cottage has dropped noticeably in the last hour, the cold creeping steadily inward from the exterior walls and the packed dirt floor. You know you must soon retreat to the heavy blankets of the bed, but you strongly resist the transition, preferring the active, conscious solitude of the waking night. You pick up your walking stick from its resting place by the door, running your bare hands over the smooth, polished hickory, tracing the small nicks and scratches earned on countless foraging trips. The wood is freezing cold and incredibly hard, a dependable tool that has supported your weight across treacherous, icy streams and through miles of dense, unforgiving underbrush. You lean heavily on it for a long moment, feeling the solid, grounding connection between your hands and the earth, even through the barrier of the wooden floorboards. The stick is a silent companion, a symbol of your ability to traverse the dangerous, untamed world that completely terrifies the very people who rely on your gathered medicines. You step toward the small, stone-lined cellar pit, lifting the heavy wooden trap-door by its recessed iron ring to quickly check on your stored provisions. The air rising from the cavity is damp and intensely earthy, smelling powerfully of raw potatoes, aging cheese, and the sweet, loamy scent of the dark soil itself. You kneel on the freezing floor, peering into the pitch-black space, mentally inventorying the heavy sacks of root vegetables and the small, precious jars of preserved summer berries. The winter has been exhaustingly long, but your carefully managed supplies remain completely adequate, a testament to your forward-thinking planning during the brief, frantic weeks of the autumn harvest. You check the wrapping on the block of cheese you received earlier in the day, ensuring the cloth is tight and secure against the pervasive, destructive dampness of the pit. You lower the heavy trapdoor back into place, the thick wood ceiling perfectly flush with the swept dirt floor, safely hiding your vital reserves from any prying eyes. You brush the cold dust from your knees, a small, triumphant smile touching your lips at the confirmation of your continued, unassailable self-sufficiency. Silence returns to the room, heavier and more complete than before, the punishing wind having finally battered itself into a temporary, uneasy submission outside the walls. The absolute stillness of the settlement at this deep hour is profound, a collective, breathless waiting for the slow, agonizing rotation of the earth to bring the sun back to the horizon. You stand perfectly still in the center of the cottage, your breathing exceptionally slow and measured, attuning your senses to the microscopic sounds of the wooden structure settling around you. A mouse scratches faintly within the timber walls, a tiny, desperate sound of survival that briefly draws your attention before fading back into the overwhelming, oppressive quiet. The air inside the room is now biting cold. the fire's warming influence severely diminished, urging you to finally seek the accumulated heat beneath the heavy wool blankets. You do not rush, moving with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a woman completely comfortable in her own heavily guarded, fiercely independent domain. The night is a vast, empty canvas, and you are the solitary figure standing resiliently in the absolute center of it. You pull the single wooden chair back from the hearth, ensuring it is a safe distance from any stray, malicious sparks that might suddenly defy the banked ashes. You unfasten the heavy linen apron from your waist, folding it neatly and placing it squarely on the seat of the chair, ready for the immediate, practical demands of the coming dawn. You brush a stray fragment of pine bark from the sleeve of your woolen bodice, the coarse woven material feeling rough and profoundly familiar beneath your cold fingertips. You check the thick wooden bar across the front door one final time, pressing your entire weight against the oak timber to ensure there is absolutely no give in the forged iron brackets. You walk to the small frosted window, resting your forehead against the freezing wood of the shutter, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the wilderness pressing back against you. You hold your position there for a long moment, breathing in the cold, sharp air that leaks steadily through the minuscule gaps in the rough joinery. You are an island of warmth and intellect in a sea of frozen, superstitious fear, holding your ground with quiet, unyielding, and absolute determination. Somewhere far out in the dark timber, a wolf lets out a long, ragged howl, the sound piercing the frigid air with terrifying, crystalline clarity. The primal cry is immediately answered by another, their voices intertwining in a complex, mournful harmony that echoes wildly across the snow-dusted canopy of the forest. The villagers would be crossing themselves in the dark right now, pulling their children closer and praying fervently for deliverance from the beasts of the devil's howling wilderness. You simply listen closely, analyzing the distance and the direction of the pack, recognizing the raw, desperate hunger that drives them to sing to the pale, hidden winter moon. They are merely another harsh facet of the brutal reality of this continent, fellow survivors navigating the severe constraints of the year 1666. The howling gradually tapers off into a series of short, sharp yips before silence completely reclaims the frozen, unforgiving landscape. You turn away from the window, the haunting melody of the wild pack lingering vividly in the quiet space of your heavily fortified cottage. You open the small wooden latch of the cupboard above the table, your fingers tracing the familiar shapes of your precious ceramic jars and small dented tin boxes. You withdraw a tiny, tightly stoppered glass vial containing a deeply concentrated tincture of valerian root, the liquid incredibly dark and viscous in the extremely dim light. You unstop the cork, the pungent, earthy odor of the root instantly filling the cold air around you, a smell that many find repulsive but you associate entirely with deep, restorative peace. You carefully pour 3 exact drops onto a small wooden spoon, your hand perfectly steady despite the freezing ambient temperature of the room. You swallow the bitter medicine without flinching, feeling the sharp, acrid taste coat the back of your throat before traveling downward to firmly settle your weary nerves. You replace the cork firmly, returning the vial to its specific place in the dark, meticulously ordered interior of the wooden cabinet. This is your personal ritual, a final, deliberate act of self-care designed to aggressively enforce calm in a world that constantly demands hypervigilance. By the time the bitter taste completely fades from your tongue, the heavy, settling quiet of the night has fully permeated every single corner of the small timber structure. The embers in the hearth have finally crusted over with a thick, insulating layer of gray ash, hiding their fierce red heat and plunging the room into almost total darkness. You navigate the tight space entirely by memory, your bare feet stepping precisely over the uneven sections of the swept dirt floor as you move toward the bed. The cold is sharp and deeply aggressive now, biting fiercely at your exposed skin and forcing your breath into rapid, visible plumes in the freezing indoor air. You reach the edge of the mattress, the dry straw rustling loudly in the silence as you press your hand against the rough, tightly woven woolen blankets. The transition from the active labor of the evening to the stillness of the deep night requires a profound, intentional slowing of your constantly racing thoughts. The village outside remains locked in its terrified, shivering state, while you stand fully awake, a silent, necessary sentinel on the absolute edge of the known world. You fold your heavy woolen shawl carefully, draping it over the footboard of the bed so it will be within immediate, desperate reach when the harsh dawn eventually breaks. You loosen the tight laces of your bodice, your incredibly cold fingers struggling slightly with the stiff leather cords before finally releasing the restrictive tension across your ribs. You slip out of the heavy outer skirt, letting the thick, coarse fabric pool on the floor beside your frozen leather boots, leaving you clad only in your long, plain woolen shift. The shock of the freezing air against your lightly clad body is severe, causing a violent, involuntary shiver to run the entire length of your rigid spine. You quickly slide beneath the mountain of heavy wool blankets, pulling them tightly up to your chin to aggressively trap the precious, rapidly escaping heat of your own body. The straw mattress contours stiffly beneath you, a hard, unforgiving surface that you have rested upon for so many years it now feels like a natural extension of yourself. You lie perfectly still, staring up into the impenetrable darkness of the low ceiling, waiting for the valerian root to weave its heavy, calming magic through your veins. Within the heavy cocoon of the blankets, a small, fiercely guarded pocket of warmth slowly begins to build, steadily pushing the agonizing chill out of your extremities. You focus intensely on the steady, rhythmic sound of your own breathing, using the slow rise and fall of your chest as an anchor against the vast, swirling silence of the cottage. The wind picks up again, rattling the shutters with renewed, desperate fury, but the sound feels distant now, separated from you by the thick timber walls and the heavy layers of woven wool. You trace the events of the long day in your mind, cataloging the successful treatment of the fever, the harsh but necessary trade at the storehouse, and the quiet, triumphant act of writing in your hidden journal. These are the solid, undeniable facts of your existence, the practical, undeniable proofs of your massive value in a society that would strongly prefer you remain entirely invisible. You are an unmarried woman in a harsh, deeply suspicious century, yet you have built a life of profound, unassailable independence through sheer intellect and heavily calloused hands. The darkness holds you safely, a familiar, comforting embrace that demands absolutely nothing in return. You turn your head slightly on the bracken-stuffed pillow, the dried ferns crinkling with a sharp, papery sound that seems incredibly loud in the absolute, crushing quiet. You keep your eyes wide open in the pitch black, carefully tracking the microscopic, almost imperceptible shifts in the temperature as the drafts trace invisible paths across the room. You listen for the distant, muffled sound of the town bell, waiting for the single, hollow toll that definitively marks the deepest, most desolate hour of the long winter night. Your mind remains intensely active, planning the complex sequence of herbal extractions you must begin when the pale light finally returns to the frosted window panes. You review the specific inventory of your root cellar, accurately calculating exactly how many days of bitter cold you can endure before you are forced to brave the icy paths of the village again. The heavy blankets press down on you with a comforting, leaden weight, firmly grounding your physical body while your intellect ranges freely over the logistical challenges of the coming days. You do not surrender to the heavy pull of exhaustion, maintaining your quiet, vigilant watch over the dark hours, fiercely guarding the independence you have fought so bitterly to secure. Through the microscopic cracks in the wooden shutters, the faintest hint of starlight manages to pierce the gloom, casting a single, incredibly thin silver thread of illumination across the floorboards. The beam is impossibly narrow, yet it catches the dust motes dancing in the freezing air, turning them into tiny, swirling constellations within the tight confines of your room. You watch the slow, majestic drift of the dust, finding a strange, hypnotic beauty, and the microscopic chaos that perfectly mirrors the larger, untamed wilderness outside. The cold continues its relentless, silent assault on the cottage walls, a mindless, elemental force that seeks to actively strip away the fragile heat generated by human defiance. You flex your fingers beneath the wool, the joint stiff but entirely functional, fully ready to grasp the knife, the pestle, or the pen when the sun eventually decides to rise. The year 1666 marches slowly, grindingly forward in the dark, entirely unaware of the solitary, unbroken woman who waits patiently in the freezing shadows. The night remains incredibly deep, absolute, and entirely yours, a vast expanse of time where you are the sole undisputed master of your own quiet destiny. You remain suspended in the heavy, unbroken silence of the deep night, your mind sharp and actively resisting the pull of exhaustion. The coarse wool of the blanket scratches pleasantly against your chin, a constant tactile reminder of your absolute unyielding presence in the freezing room. You trace the invisible patterns of the woven fabric with your thumb, feeling the natural oils of the sheep still lingering faintly in the tight threads. The darkness around you is total, stripping away the visual distractions of the daylight and forcing your other senses to wildly compensate. You breathe in slowly, cataloging the distinct layers of scent trapped within the small timber walls, identifying the sharp tang of dried yarrow over the dull, earthy smell of the packed dirt floor. The cold presses heavily against the exposed skin of your face, a physical, heavy weight that demands constant, low-level endurance. Outside the fortified timber walls, the wind shifts its angle slightly, producing a low, moaning sound as it drags across the heavily thatched roof. The sudden change in pressure forces a sharp, icy draft down the blackened chimney, scattering a few invisible flakes of ash across the stone hearth. Small, unseen creatures scurry briefly beneath the floorboards, their tiny claws scraping frantically against the frozen earth before returning to perfect stillness. This microscopic activity emphasizes the profound isolation of the cottage, highlighting the delicate, fragile nature of warmth in a deeply hostile environment. The village remains completely locked in its terrified slumber, entirely unaware of the subtle, shifting dynamics of the 17th-century winter night. You shift your weight cautiously on the straw-filled mattress, attempting to locate a slightly softer depression without exposing any warmth to the freezing air. The dried bracken rustles loudly in the suffocating quiet, the sharp, papery sound echoing off the low, invisible ceiling directly above your head. You close your eyes not to sleep, but to focus your thoughts entirely on the complex chemical extractions required for tomorrow's medicinal brewing. You mentally sort through your limited supplies of imported salts and local beeswax, calculating the exact ratios necessary to produce a salve strong enough to combat the looming threat of frostbite. The intellectual exercise keeps your mind fiercely engaged, pushing back the creeping lethargy that threatens to dull your essential protective instincts. You are an architect of survival, constructing invisible barriers against disease and exposure, using nothing more than gathered weeds and sheer, unadulterated willpower. Shadows do not exist in a room entirely devoid of light, leaving the space feeling strangely vast and completely unmoored from its physical dimensions. The familiar boundaries of the cottage dissolve into a boundless, freezing void, forcing you to rely entirely on your intimate, spatial memory of the carefully arranged furniture. An unexpected loud crack from a freezing timber beam startles the silence, sounding violently like a heavy iron hammer striking solid oak. The sudden noise sends a brief, adrenaline-fueled jolt through your chest, a primal, inherited response to the unpredictable terrors of the wilderness. The structure settles immediately afterward, groaning softly as the contracting wood attempts to find a new stable equilibrium in the plummeting temperatures. You bring your hands together beneath the heavy layers of wool, rubbing your palms briskly to generate a small, desperately needed friction of heat. The calluses on your fingers catch against each other, feeling rough and incredibly dense. the physical legacy of decades spent grinding tough roots and hauling freezing water. You stretch your fingers wide, feeling the joints pop and crack in the cold, maintaining their vital flexibility against the paralyzing chill of the deep night. You know that stiff, unresponsive hands could mean the difference between properly applying a tourniquet and watching a neighbor bleed out on the frozen ground. You perform these small, invisible exercises with religious dedication, treating your body not as a temple, but as a crucial, highly refined tool of your perilous trade. The darkness hides your meticulous efforts, preserving the illusion of effortless competence you present to the deeply suspicious villagers during the day. Time stretches into a strange, elastic medium during these profound, sunless hours, detaching completely from the rigid schedules dictated by the magistrate and the minister. The concept of an hour loses all meaning, replaced entirely by the slow, grinding endurance of the physical body against the relentless cold. You measure the duration of the night by the gradual numbness creeping into your toes and the increasing stiffness of the heavy wool draped across your chest. The settlement exists in a state of suspended animation, waiting desperately for the astronomical machinery of the solar system to bring relief to their frozen, vulnerable boxes. The universe feels incredibly indifferent to the struggles of the isolated colony, a vast, uncaring expanse of ice and empty space completely devoid of divine intervention. You carefully extract one arm from the warmth of the blankets, reaching out into the freezing void to locate the edge of the wooden bed frame. The solid oak is painfully cold to the touch, feeling almost indistinguishable from a block of solid ice left outside in the bitter gale. You trace the rough grain of the wood, grounding yourself in the undeniable physical reality of the cottage when the sensory deprivation threatens to induce a waking dream. You quickly pull your arm back under the covers, shivering violently as the exposed skin protests the sudden severe drop in ambient temperature. You tuck your hands tightly under your arms, curling your body into a compact, heat-preserving posture that minimizes your surface area against the invading chill. You are a master of these tiny, necessary adjustments, having spent countless winters perfecting the solitary art of enduring the brutal New England dark. Memories of the past autumn occasionally drift through the enforced calm of your mind, bringing fleeting, vivid flashes of color to the monochromatic night. You recall the incredibly brilliant, violent red of the maple leaves against the gray, turbulent sky, a desperate, final display of life before the killing frosts arrived. You remember the chaotic, frantic energy of the harvest, the entire village working themselves to the point of collapse to secure the precious grain that currently fills the communal storehouse. Those frantic, sunlit days feel like they belong to an entirely different, impossible world, separated from the current reality by an impenetrable wall of ice and howling wind. The contrast serves only to heighten your profound appreciation for the meager, heavily rationed resources you managed to secure for your own isolated survival. You mentally review the complex, intricate root systems of the various medicinal plants currently dormant beneath the heavy, suffocating layer of snow in the forest. You visualize the exact location of a specific patch of bloodroot, memorizing its position relative to a lightning-struck oak tree for rapid retrieval when the ground finally thaws. You plan your spring foraging routes with military precision, anticipating the desperate, sudden need for fresh remedies when the winter sickness eventually breaks its hold on the village. You do not leave your survival to chance or the whimsical providence preached from the pulpit, relying entirely on your own rigorous, empirical knowledge of the natural world. You are actively building your future in the pitch-black, weaving strategies and contingencies that will keep you indispensable to the very people who eagerly whisper about your damned soul. Silence presses inward with a nearly physical weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that threatens to smother the faint, rhythmic sound of your own breathing. The wind has temporarily ceased its relentless battering, leaving the frozen world trapped in a state of eerie, absolute stillness that feels deeply unnatural. This specific quality of quiet usually precedes the heaviest, most destructive blizzards, a sudden dropping of atmospheric pressure that signals an impending, violent shift in the weather. You listen intently for the first microscopic sounds of falling snow brushing against the wooden shingles, your senses straining to detect the subtle changes in the environment. The deep night holds its secrets tightly, offering no clues to the specific trials the coming day will inevitably bring to the isolated, terrified settlement. You run your tongue over your dry, cracked lips, tasting the faint, lingering bitterness of the valerian root you consumed hours ago. The herbal medicine continues to hold your nervous system in a state of calm, relaxed vigilance, preventing the creeping anxieties of the dark from taking root in your mind. You value this deeply controlled state above almost everything else, viewing emotional volatility as a dangerous, unnecessary liability in a world that demands absolute, unwavering pragmatism. You refuse to surrender to the superstitious fears that paralyze the other women of the village, rejecting their demons and witches in favor of the harsh, undeniable realities of chemistry and biology. You are an anomaly, a woman who looks into the terrifying, howling wilderness and sees only a vast, incredibly well-stocked apothecary waiting to be properly utilized. Frost continues its slow, aggressive expansion across the interior of the single window, the ice crystals connecting and branching in complex fractal patterns. Although you cannot see the delicate structures forming in the pitch black, you know exactly how they are mapping the microscopic air currents that leak through the imperfect wooden shutters. The cold is a meticulous, relentless artist, transforming the simple glass panes into thick, opaque shields of heavily textured ice by the time the morning light eventually arrives. The drop in temperature is a tangible, aggressive force, seeking out the residual warmth of the banked fire and systematically neutralizing it until the room matches the harshness of the exterior world. The battle for thermal dominance is quietly raging all around you, a silent, deadly conflict that defines the core struggle of existence in the 17th century. You begin to compose a theoretical letter in your mind, addressed to no one in particular, detailing the specific, brutal realities of living on the edge of the known world. You articulate the profound, crushing weight of the isolation, the constant low-level paranoia of the villagers, and the immense hidden power held by those who control the medicinal knowledge. You arrange the words with sharp, unyielding precision, creating a secret, unwritten manifesto of female independence that would surely see you banished or worse if spoken aloud. You revel in the dangerous, illicit thrill of these forbidden thoughts, safely hidden behind the impenetrable wall of your solitary, deeply guarded silence. You are completely free in the dark, an unchained intellect roaming wildly through the heavily restricted, dogmatic landscape of the Puritan imagination. Air quality within the sealed cottage grows increasingly stale and heavy, lacking the fresh, biting oxygen of the frozen outdoors. The smell of the extinguished tallow candle lingers persistently, a greasy, slightly rancid odor that mixes unpleasantly with the heavy scent of the damp, woolen blankets. The atmosphere feels incredibly dense, requiring a conscious, deliberate effort to pull the freezing air deep into your lungs and push it back out. This stagnant environment is a necessary compromise, the high price paid for sealing every crack and crevice against the lethal, sub-zero temperatures raging just beyond the timber walls. The physical confinement of the winter night is absolute, transforming the small room into a heavily fortified cell designed exclusively for the purpose of biological survival. You systematically tighten the muscles in your legs, holding the intense, cramping tension for a count of 5 before slowly releasing it back into the straw mattress. You repeat this deliberate isometric exercise for your arms, your abdomen, and your shoulders, forcing the sluggish, freezing blood to circulate forcefully through your resting body. You generate a small, vital burst of internal heat through this disciplined and visible exertion, pushing back the creeping numbness that constantly threatens your heavily insulated extremities. You are intimately connected to the mechanical functions of your own anatomy, managing your biological resources with the same strict, uncompromising efficiency that you apply to your herbal apothecary. You do not passively endure the cold. You actively, aggressively manage your body's response to it, a continuous, conscious rebellion against the indifferent forces of nature. Wood within the cottage continues its erratic, unpredictable settling, the ancient oak beams releasing sudden, sharp reports as the moisture inside them freezes solid. The structural sounds are a constant, chaotic symphony that completely shatters the illusion of static, unchanging shelter, reminding you that the house itself is engaged in a brutal struggle against the elements. The timber frame groans heavily under the massive, invisible weight of the shifting atmospheric pressure, the massive joints grinding together in the freezing dark. You know the exact age and origin of the massive logs supporting the roof, having watched the village men fell the massive pines and drag them from the forest edge decades ago. The house is a living, complaining entity, a physical manifestation of the immense collective labor required to carve a foothold out of the hostile, unforgiving continent. You carefully trace the rough, uneven stitching of the wool blanket where you repaired a significant tear the previous winter, your fingers easily locating the thick, raised scar of hemp thread. You remember the exact biting cold of the afternoon you spent forcing the bone needle to the heavy fabric, your hands cramped and bleeding from the intense, repetitive effort. You take immense, quiet pride in the durability of the repair, knowing that the clumsy but incredibly strong stitches will hold the essential layers together for another decade of brutal use. You are defined entirely by your ability to mend, to fix, to restore what the harsh environment inevitably damages, whether it is a torn blanket, a rusted blade, or a feverish child. You are the invisible, unacknowledged glue holding the fragile edges of your own life and the life of the village completely together. Thoughts turn briefly toward the distant, almost mythic continent across the ocean, a place of crowded, filthy streets and massive, ancient stone cathedrals that you barely remember. The old world feels like an impossible, fabricated story, a complex, crowded narrative that has absolutely no bearing on the stark, immediate realities of survival on the frontier. The delicate, intricate politics of kings and bishops seem incredibly absurd when compared to the absolute life-or-death importance of a properly sealed root cellar or a well-stocked supply of willow bark. The Atlantic Ocean represents an impenetrable, terrifying void, a vast expanse of chaotic water that completely severs you from the history and the heavy, restrictive traditions of your ancestors. You exist entirely in the present tense, a pragmatic, hyper-focused survivor operating in a completely unforgiving, incredibly demanding vacuum. You bring your focus back to the immediate, pressing sensation of the cold creeping stealthily along the exposed edges of the straw mattress. You execute a precise, calculated roll, shifting your entire body weight to tuck the overhanging wool blankets tightly underneath your side, effectively sealing the drafty perimeter. You arrange your limbs efficiently within the newly secured, tightly constrained space, maximizing the retention of your own body heat while minimizing contact with the freezing air. You breathe a slow, silent sigh of satisfaction, successfully outmaneuvering the microscopic, invasive fingers of the winter night with a simple, highly effective physical adjustment. You remain totally alert, your eyes wide open in the absolute dark, a fiercely independent, unbroken woman holding her ground in the deepest, most desolate hours of the year. Quiet reasserts itself with a vengeance, the temporary cessation of the wind leaving the frozen landscape in a state of suspended, agonizing anticipation. The total lack of external auditory input forces your brain to amplify the internal sounds of your own body, the heavy, rhythmic thud of your heart suddenly sounding incredibly loud in the small room. You focus intently on the steady, reliable beat, using it as a biological metronome to pace your thoughts and maintain your fiercely guarded emotional equilibrium. The isolation is total and absolute, a profound physical separation from the rest of humanity that would drive a weaker mind into a state of stark, raving panic. You embrace the emptiness, finding a deep, unshakable power in the knowledge that you require absolutely no one else to validate your existence or ensure your continued survival. You carefully map the invisible architecture of the dark room in your mind, visualizing the exact placement of the hearth, the heavy wooden table, and the heavily secured door. You mentally rehearse the precise sequence of steps required to quickly navigate the pitch-black space in the event of an unforeseen, catastrophic emergency. You calculate the distance to your sharpest knife, the heavy iron poker, and your thickest winter cloak, preparing your mind for immediate, decisive action should the perimeter be breached. You do not trust the fragile wooden palisade protecting the village, relying instead on your own rigorous paranoid preparation and your intimate, detailed knowledge of your immediate surroundings. You are a solitary warrior in a constant state of low-level readiness, refusing to surrender your safety to the inept, terrified guards patrolling the distant edge of the settlement. Stars rotating slowly above the heavily thatched roof remain completely hidden from your view, their cold, indifferent light blocked entirely by the thick, frost-covered shutters. You know they are out there, vast burning spheres of gas tracking across the vast empty expanse of the winter sky in complex, predictable patterns that completely ignore the struggles below. The sheer, terrifying scale of the cosmos is a concept you occasionally entertain to purposefully dwarf the petty, malicious gossip and the rigid, suffocating dogmas of the Puritan congregation. The universe is terrifyingly huge and incredibly cold, a reality that makes the small, fiercely defended pocket of heat within your cottage feel like a massive, undeniable triumph of the human will. The deep night continues its slow, agonizing crawl, a vast, empty ocean of time that you navigate with the quiet, unyielding patience of a woman who answers only to herself. You throw the heavy woolen blankets aside entirely, resigning yourself to the absolute impossibility of rest, while the relentless, freezing demands of the long winter night continue to pull at your waking mind. The freezing air strikes your exposed skin like a physical blow, a harsh, immediate reminder of the incredibly fragile boundary between your pulsing biological life and the lethal temperatures dominating the New England landscape. You swing your legs over the edge of the low straw mattress, your bare feet finding the familiar freezing surface of the packed earthen floor with a sudden involuntary gasp. The darkness is completely unbroken, an oppressive, suffocating weight that presses against your open eyes and forces your other senses into a state of hyper-vigilant, defensive overdrive. You wrap the thick, fringed shawl tightly over your linen shift, securing the coarse material across your chest to trap the rapidly dissipating warmth of your own body before it completely vanishes into the icy room. Silence rushes in to fill the brief, terrifying voids between the howling gusts of the Atlantic gale, a deep, ringing quiet that seems to dramatically amplify the sound of your own accelerating heartbeat. The utter stillness of the isolated cottage is profound, broken only by the microscopic, sharp cracking of the massive oak timbers as the moisture trapped within their ancient grain freezes completely solid. You know every single structural groan and shifting shadow of this heavily fortified sanctuary, interpreting the ambient noises of the building as a complex, continuous language of survival. This solitary existence is not a punishment, but a carefully curated, heavily defended choice, allowing you to operate entirely outside the rigid, suffocating social hierarchies that govern the sleeping villagers just a mile away. You stand perfectly still in the pitch black, grounding your physical presence in the center of the room before attempting to navigate the treacherous, freezing space. You navigate the pitch black room with absolute, unhesitating precision, your bare feet relying on muscle memory honed over decades of solitary residence in this exact, unvarying layout. You step over the slight depression near the heavy wooden table, avoiding the sharp, uneven edge of the stone hearth as you move blindly toward the massive, silent shape of the oak loom dominating the far wall. The air in this corner of the cottage feels incredibly stagnant and dense, smelling strongly of raw lanolin, tightly spun wool, and the faint dusty scent of dried wooden gears. You reach out your freezing hand, letting your sensitive fingertips brush gently against the tightly strung warp threads, feeling the incredible humming tension of the suspended fibers waiting patiently in the dark. The loom is a complex, beautiful machine of profound independence, a tool that allows you to transform raw, chaotic fleeces into the incredibly durable, weather-resistant cloth that commands such high respect at the communal storehouse. Wood smoke from the deeply banked hearth hangs incredibly low in the stagnant air, creating a dense, invisible ceiling of scent that violently traps the ambient cold firmly against the earthen floor. You breathe in the acrid, familiar smell, finding a strange primal comfort in the lingering evidence of the fire that has kept you alive through so many brutal, unforgiving winters. You run your hands lovingly over the smooth, polished wood of the heavy beater, feeling the deep, worn grooves where your fingers have rested through countless thousands of repetitive, rhythmic strikes. The tactile sensation of the heavy timber grounds you instantly, completely dispelling the creeping, superstitious anxieties that inevitably attempt to invade the mind during the deepest, most desolate hours of the 17th-century night. You are a master of this intricate mechanical process, utilizing the dark hours to perform the meticulous, tactile work that requires absolutely no visual confirmation to execute flawlessly. You sit down heavily on the polished wooden bench facing the loom, the hard, unyielding surface sending a fresh shock of cold shooting sharply up the base of your spine. You locate the heavy wooden shuttle entirely by touch, your fingers wrapping securely around the smooth, boat-shaped tool that holds a tightly wound bobbin of freshly spun, coarse gray yarn. You press your bare foot down firmly on the right treadle, listening to the complex arrangement of harnesses and heddles lift the warp threads with a satisfying, precise wooden clatter. You throw the shuttle blindly through the open shed, catching it expertly on the opposite side with a sharp, fluid motion before pulling the heavy beater forward with a loud, authoritative thwack. The rhythmic, percussive sounds of the weaving process begin to fill the terrifyingly quiet room, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that loudly declares your continued, defiant survival against the absolute darkness. Memories of the previous summer drift unbidden into your deeply focused mind, bringing fleeting, vivid flashes of intense heat and blinding sunlight into the freezing, monochromatic reality of the winter night. You clearly recall standing waist-deep in the rushing, icy waters of the local stream, aggressively scrubbing the grease and dirt from the heavy, raw fleeces before the shearing season officially ended. The grueling, back-breaking labor had left your hands raw and bleeding for a week, a physical toll exacted by the harsh environment that you paid without a single word of public complaint. Those frantic, sunlit days feel like an impossible, fabricated myth right now, separated from your current reality by an impenetrable, towering wall of ice, howling wind, and months of brutal, isolating cold. You focus intently on the texture of the emerging cloth beneath your fingertips, transforming the grueling memories of summer labor into tangible, life-saving winter warmth. You throw the shuttle back through the alternating work threads, your feet dancing automatically across the wooden treadles in a complex, deeply ingrained choreography of independent production. The incredibly coarse, heavy fabric grows microscopic fraction by fraction in the total darkness, a slow, agonizingly deliberate accumulation of material that perfectly mirrors the grueling pace of life on the colonial frontier. You trace the freshly woven edge with your thumb, checking for any incredibly subtle flaws or loose tensions that might compromise the structural integrity of the final, finished garment. The villagers eagerly trade their precious salt and preserved meats for this exact, unyielding cloth, entirely unaware that the fabric shielding them from the lethal winds was woven by an unmarried woman operating in complete, pitch-black solitude. You smile grimly in the dark, finding a deep, subversive satisfaction in the immense hidden power your skilled, calloused hands wield over the supposedly superior, righteous men of the congregation. Drafts creeping across the swept earthen floor bite viciously at your exposed ankles, a constant aggressive reminder that the lethal temperatures outside are constantly seeking a way to breach your defenses. You pause your rhythmic weaving for just a moment, reaching down to aggressively rub your freezing calves, attempting to force the sluggish, thickened blood to circulate back into your numbing extremities. The physical discomfort is incredibly severe, a gnawing, aching pain that settles deep into the marrow of your bones, yet you refuse to abandon the loom for the temporary false comfort of the heavy blankets. You are actively building your own economic security in the dead of night, knowing that a massive, completed bolt of heavy wool is the absolute best insurance policy against the unpredictable whims of the town magistrate. You resume your steady, percussive work, matching the harsh, mechanical clatter of the heavy wooden beater against the violent, howling gusts of the unrelenting Atlantic gale. Moonlight briefly manages to penetrate the thick, swirling clouds outside, casting an incredibly faint, ghostly silver glow through the microscopic cracks in the heavy wooden window shutters. The fragile, almost imperceptible light barely illuminates the massive, looming shape of the loom, turning the taut, stretched threads into a shimmering, ethereal web suspended in the center of the freezing room. You do not look toward the window, keeping your eyes completely closed to heighten the incredible tactile sensitivity of your freezing fingers as they guide the heavy wooden shuttle through the dark. The brief shift in the atmospheric illumination signals a massive drop in the barometric pressure, a terrifying indication that the current winter storm is preparing to unleash a secondary, even more destructive phase. You simply increase the driving pace of your weaving, your hands and feet moving with a frantic, desperate energy to generate internal heat and maximize your productive output before the true deep freeze sets in. You run your thumb over a small, incredibly tight knot in the woolen yarn, a minor, inevitable imperfection caused by a sudden breakage during the tedious spinning process weeks ago. You carefully manipulate the heavy threads with your freezing fingernails, forcing the stubborn knot to the hidden underside of the fabric where it will not chafe against the sensitive skin of the eventual wearer. This meticulous, unseen attention to detail is exactly what elevates your solitary craftsmanship far above the hasty, careless work produced by the exhausted, overworked wives of the crowded settlement. You take immense, quiet pride in the absolute perfection of your product, knowing that your intense, uncompromising standards are the true foundation of your heavily guarded, fiercely independent life. You throw the heavy shuttle again, the sharp, clattering impact of the wooden beater echoing loudly against the low, frost-covered ceiling of the isolated timber cottage. Fatigue attempts to violently hijack your incredibly focused mind, sending heavy, rhythmic waves of pure exhaustion crashing through your aching shoulders and stiff, freezing lower back. You fiercely resist the overwhelming biological urge to collapse, narrowing your intense concentration solely to the repetitive, mesmerizing motion of the smooth wooden shuttle flying through the open shed. The concept of time completely evaporates in the pitch-black room, leaving you suspended in the strange, mechanical trance where only the physical creation of the coarse woolen fabric actually matters. You are a vital turning gear in the massive, invisible machinery of frontier survival, transforming raw, agricultural output into the essential, protective armor required to endure the horrific realities of 1666. You clench your jaw tightly against the searing pain in your cramped hands, aggressively pushing your physical limits far beyond the breaking point of an ordinary, fully supported member of the congregation. You carefully calculate the remaining length of the warp threads entirely by the shifting tension of the heavy wooden beams, determining that you have nearly reached the end of this massive, exhausting project. The anticipation of completing the heavy bolt of cloth provides a sudden, desperately needed surge of adrenaline, cutting sharply through the numbing cold and the crushing, overwhelming weight of your accumulated exhaustion. You press the wooden treadles with renewed, vicious force, the loud, rhythmic clattering of the ancient loom reaching a frantic, aggressive crescendo in the completely darkened, freezing room. You are racing against the invisible, creeping lethargy of the deep night, determined to sever the finished fabric from the frame before the agonizing cold permanently locks your aching, stiffening joints. You catch the flying shuttle with brutal efficiency, your hands moving entirely on instinct, completely bypassing the need for any visual confirmation in the absolute, suffocating blackness. Iron tools resting on the nearby wooden table rattle incredibly faintly in sympathetic vibration with the violent percussive impacts of the heavy wooden beater striking the tightening cloth. The incredibly subtle, metallic sound adds a harsh, industrial layer to the rhythmic symphony of your labor. A stark, audible reminder of the harsh, unyielding materials that dominate this brutal colonial era. You imagine the sharp, wicked edge of your hunting knife sitting patiently in the dark, a necessary, deadly implement that guarantees your physical safety in a world completely devoid of reliable, organized protection. The heavy tools, the massive oak loom, and the thick, iron-bound door are the physical, undeniable manifestations of your fiercely guarded autonomy, separating you permanently from the soft, dependent lives of the village women. You strike the woven cloth one final, authoritative time, feeling the incredible, dense solidity of the finished material beneath your raw, bleeding fingertips. You reach blindly for the small, incredibly sharp iron shears resting on the smooth wooden bench beside you, the freezing metal instantly draining the last remaining warmth from your cramped, aching hand. You carefully slide the sharp blades beneath the incredibly taut, stretched warp threads, cutting through the thick, resistant wool with a series of sharp, satisfying metallic snips. The sudden release of the massive tension causes the heavy oak frame to groan loudly in the dark, the wooden structure physically relaxing after weeks of holding the incredible, vibrating strain. You gather the heavy, completely finished bolt of coarse cloth into your arms, the massive weight of the dense fabric providing an immediate, luxurious barrier against the freezing, stagnant air of the room. You have successfully pulled a massive, life-sustaining resource entirely out of the freezing, pitch-black void, a profound act of creation that loudly justifies your terrifying, isolated existence on the very edge of the howling wilderness. You stand up slowly from the wooden bench, your knees popping violently in the agonizing quiet, the sudden movement sending a sharp, sickening wave of dizziness crashing through your exhausted skull. You clutch the heavy bolt of fresh woolen cloth tightly against your chest, burying your freezing face in the rough, lanolin-scented material to aggressively inhale the rich, earthy smell of your own monumental labor. The physical exertion has successfully warded off the creeping, lethal frost, but the metabolic cost is incredibly high, leaving your muscles trembling uncontrollably in the absolute, unforgiving dark. You carefully navigate your way back to the heavy straw mattress, the thick protective fabric serving as a massive, tangible shield against the invisible, aggressive draft sweeping across the packed earthen floor. You sit heavily on the edge of the bed, completely drained, wrapping the freshly severed, incredibly dense wool securely around your shivering shoulders as you continue to hold your solitary, unbroken vigil over the long, terrifying night. The deepest, most lethal cold of the entire night always settles into the cottage just before the first hints of dawn attempt to breach the horizon. You remain seated on the edge of the straw mattress, the freshly woven woolen cloth draped heavily across your shivering shoulders like a protective, lanolin-scented shroud. The temperature inside the room has plummeted to a dangerous, agonizing low, turning every breath you take into a thick, visible plume of white vapor that hangs suspended in the stagnant air. You can feel the absolute crushing weight of the frozen atmosphere pressing against the thick oak walls, seeking any microscopic vulnerability in the dried mud chinking to invade your sanctuary. The total darkness remains completely unbroken, but the subtle, shifting quality of the silence suggests that the long, terrifying night is finally beginning its slow, grudging retreat. You tightly clutch the edges of the heavy fabric, drawing the coarse material securely across your chest to trap the last, fading remnants of your internal body heat. Your hands throb with a dull, persistent ache, the raw, bleeding skin on your fingertips, a harsh physical testament to the grueling, unbroken hours spent manipulating the massive wooden loom. You slowly flex your stiffened joints, wincing slightly as the numbed muscles protest the deliberate, necessary movement in the freezing, pitch-black room. You know that remaining completely stationary for too long in these sub-zero temperatures invites the silent, creeping death of hypothermia that claims so many unwary souls during the long New England winters. You force yourself to stand up, your legs trembling violently under the sudden weight, relying heavily on sheer, unadulterated willpower to overcome the overwhelming biological urge to simply collapse into the straw. Frost has aggressively claimed the interior of the single window, building a thick, opaque shield of complex ice crystals that completely blocks any potential light from the outside world. The stone hearth sits completely dark and silent, the once glowing bed of oak embers having long since succumbed to the suffocating, relentless cold creeping across the swept earthen floor. The smell of the extinguished fire lingers heavily in the stagnant air, a sharp, acrid scent that mixes intimately with the rich, earthy aroma of the raw wool wrapped around your shoulders. Every wooden surface in the cottage feels indistinguishable from solid ice, radiating a severe, aggressive chill that actively drains the warmth from your sensitive, calloused fingertips upon contact. The environment is entirely hostile, a stark, unforgiving reality that demands constant, hyper-vigilant attention to the microscopic details of basic survival. You carefully navigate the pitch-black space, using only your highly refined spatial memory, your bare feet stepping precisely over the freezing, packed dirt floor to reach the dormant fireplace. You kneel painfully on the braided wool rug, the coarse fibers offering only a marginal, temporary relief from the agonizing cold radiating upward from the frozen earth beneath the cottage. You reach blindly into a small, hidden alcove beside the chimney, your fingers locating a tightly bound bundle of dried birch bark and a small, precious tin containing your flint and steel. You arrange the papery, highly flammable bark over the dead gray ashes, your movements slow and incredibly deliberate as your numbed hands struggle to execute the fine motor tasks required for ignition. You strike the steel aggressively against the sharp edge of the flint, sending a sudden, brilliant shower of tiny orange sparks cascading downward into the waiting, highly combustible tinder. A single, fragile spark finally catches the edge of the dried bark, blooming instantly into a small, desperate ribbon of yellow flame that rapidly devours the papery material. You lean in close, blowing softly and steadily into the center of the growing fire, coaxing the delicate heat to spread deeper into the carefully arranged pile of kindling. The sudden, localized warmth touches your freezing face like a physical blessing, a sharp, contrasting shock to your system that violently jolts your exhausted mind back into a state of sharp clarity. You add several small split pieces of seasoned oak to the fledgling blaze, watching closely as the hungry flames eagerly wrap themselves around the dry, resin-rich wood. The fire begins to snap and crackle loudly in the silent room, casting a violent, shifting orange glow that aggressively pushes the oppressive, suffocating shadows back into the far corners of the cottage. You remain kneeling before the resurrected hearth for a long time, allowing the intense, radiant heat to slowly penetrate the thick layers of wool and thaw your deeply chilled bones. You rub your hands vigorously over the leaping flames, turning your palms and wrists to ensure the precious, life-saving warmth circulates evenly through your stiff, aching joints. The physical pain of returning circulation is intense and sharply unpleasant, a burning, prickling sensation that confirms you have successfully warded off the permanent destructive damage of severe frostbite. You watch the dancing light illuminate the rough-hewn beams above your head, highlighting the hanging bundles of dried yarrow and meadowsweet that represent your vast, hidden apothecary. You have survived another brutal, isolating night on the absolute edge of the known world, relying entirely on your own rigorous preparation and uncompromising solitary resilience. Beyond the heavily fortified walls, the wind begins to drastically shift its direction, the high, mournful howling dropping to a low, sustained vibration that rattles the wooden shingles overhead. A distant, muffled sound breaks the absolute stillness of the frozen settlement, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a heavy iron axe biting deep into solid, frozen timber. Someone in the village has also risen early to combat the lethal cold, initiating the grueling, endless cycle of physical labor that defines every waking moment of colonial existence. The solitary, rhythmic thudding echoes faintly across the snow-dusted canopy, a stark, audible reminder of the terrified, desperate community huddled together just a mile away from your isolated sanctuary. The world is slowly, grudgingly preparing to wake, bringing with it the intense, scrutinizing gaze of a society that views your independent, unmarried status with profound, unwavering suspicion. You slowly rise from the braided rug, your joints popping loudly in protest as you carefully adjust the heavy bolt of woven wool draped securely across your shoulders. You walk toward the heavy wooden door, the thick iron hinges groaning violently in the freezing air as you lift the massive oak locking bar from its forged metal brackets. You pull the door inward just a fraction of an inch, wincing as the incredibly sharp, biting wind instantly slices through the narrow opening and strikes your face like a physical blow. The sky above the towering, jagged silhouette of the forest is no longer absolute black, but a deep, bruised shade of indigo that signals the very earliest, tentative stages of the approaching dawn. You stand in the freezing draft for a moment, breathing in the incredibly sharp, clean scent of the pine-scented snow, mentally preparing yourself for the rigorous, demanding tasks of the coming day. You push the heavy door shut and securely drop the iron bar back into place, sealing the aggressive, sub-zero elements outside where they belong. You move back to the table, retrieving a heavy cast-iron bucket that had been filled with fresh water the previous evening and left sitting dangerously far from the protective heat of the hearth. You strike the solid, opaque surface of the ice with the heavy handle of your iron knife, shattering the frozen barrier with a loud, sharp crack that echoes brightly in the small room. You pour a generous measure of the freezing, sloshing water into your heavy iron kettle, swinging the trammel hook smoothly over the actively leaping flames of the newly established fire. The grueling, inescapable routine of maintaining biological existence has officially begun again, an endless, cyclical battle against dehydration, starvation, and the ever-present threat of the New England winter. Illumination within the cottage slowly begins to shift its quality, the harsh, flickering orange light of the fire mixing with the incredibly faint gray seeping through the edges of the frosted window. The transition from night to dawn is not a gentle, welcoming process in this brutal era, but a slow, agonizingly cold revelation of the stark, frozen realities dominating the landscape. You can see the cloudy, vaporous plumes of your own breath hanging suspended in the frigid air, a constant, visual reminder of the precarious, fragile nature of human respiration in such a hostile environment. The interior of the room becomes sharply defined, the rough textures of the mud chinking and the smooth, polished surface of the wooden table standing out in stark, high-contrast relief. The day is arriving with absolute, unforgiving certainty, demanding your immediate, full attention and your continued, uncompromising physical labor. You carefully fold the massive, newly woven bolt of woolen cloth, smoothing the coarse, lanolin-rich fabric with your calloused hands before placing it securely inside the heavy wooden chest at the foot of your bed. This tangible, heavy product of your nocturnal labor represents a massive infusion of economic security, a highly valuable commodity that will guarantee your continued access to the communal salt and grain stores. You lower the heavy oak lid of the chest, the dull, resonant thud sealing your hard-won independence safely away from the prying, judgmental eyes of the local magistrate and his suspicious deputies. You untie the rough linen coif from your head, running your stiff fingers through your silver-streaked hair, completely unconcerned with the vanity or the rigid modesty demanded by the village goodwives. You operate entirely by your own strict, internal code of conduct, a solitary woman forging an unassailable path through a world explicitly designed to subjugate and control her. You retrieve a small hardened heel of dark rye bread from the wooden shelf above the table, the crust feeling incredibly dense and unyielding against your thumb. You slice the bread into thin, manageable pieces using your newly sharpened iron knife, the wicked blade sliding effortlessly through the tough, stale material with a highly satisfying, destructive efficiency. You place the rough slices on a wooden trencher, adding a small, incredibly precious scraping of salted butter that you aggressively hoarded from a trade conducted earlier in the autumn. The simple, heavy calories are absolutely essential for fueling the massive metabolic engine required to simply maintain a baseline body temperature during the grueling, sub-zero mornings. You eat standing perfectly still near the roaring fire, chewing the dense sour bread methodically while staring blankly into the dancing, mesmerizing flames. You lift the heavy iron kettle from the trammel hook, using a thick, padded rag, the water inside now vibrating intensely as it rapidly approaches a full rolling boil. You pour a measure of the steaming liquid over a crushed handful of dried mint leaves resting in a small battered tin cup, instantly releasing a sharp, incredibly clean aroma into the stagnant air. You cradle the hot metal cup carefully in your hands, allowing the intense radiating heat to deeply penetrate the raw, aching joints of your abused fingers. You sip the scalding, bitter infusion slowly, feeling the incredibly hot liquid travel downward through your chest, physically melting the residual icy dread left behind by the terrifying, isolated night. You are fully awake and entirely functional, your mind razor sharp and completely prepared to face the complex, demanding challenges of the arriving day. Daylight finally begins to assert its dominance over the frozen landscape, the pale, washed-out shade of slate gray revealing the towering skeletal silhouettes of the ancient forest border. The village bell suddenly begins to toll, a harsh, clanging, metallic sound that shatters the morning quiet and forcefully dictates the official commencement of labor for the terrified, obedient congregation. The sound is a harsh daily reminder of the rigid, suffocating social structure you actively defied by choosing to live alone on the absolute, dangerous fringe of the cleared settlement. You listen to the ringing fade slowly into the freezing wind, feeling absolutely no compulsion to join the frightened villagers in their frantic, highly scrutinized rush toward the cold, unheated meeting house. You belong entirely to the wilderness and to the quiet, profound authority of your own accumulated knowledge, completely insulated from the hysterical, dogmatic demands of the 17th-century patriarchy. You place the empty tin cup firmly on the wooden table, the metallic clink sounding sharp and decisive in the warming room. You reach for the thick leather apron hanging near the hearth, tying the heavy strap securely around your waist to protect your woolen garments from the inevitable dirt and stains of the morning chores. You pull your thick winter cloak back over your shoulders, raising the deep hood to shield your face from the brutal wind that you know is waiting just beyond the threshold. You grasp the polished hickory walking stick leaning against the frame, feeling the solid, grounding weight of the wood anchor you to the harsh physical reality of your existence. You are ready to step back into the brutal, judgmental world of the Puritan colony, armed with your herbs, your unparalleled resilience, and your absolute unbreakable independence. You step across the heavy oak threshold and out into the biting, unforgiving reality of the 17th-century morning, your boots crunching loudly against the heavily frosted earth. The sky above the settlement has transitioned from the bruised indigo of the deep night into a pale, washed-out slate that offers illumination without a single fraction of warmth. You pull the heavy woolen hood further forward to shield your face from the sharp, driving wind that sweeps relentlessly off the unseen, turbulent waters of the Atlantic. The village stretches out before you in a series of stark, rigid geometric shapes, the steep pitched roofs heavily burdened with accumulated snowfall and hanging icicles that resemble jagged crystalline teeth. You grip the polished hickory walking stick with numb, aching fingers, allowing the solid, dependable weight of the wood to anchor you firmly to the treacherous, ice-licked path leading toward the town square. Smoke rises from 24 distinct chimneys in thick gray pillars, each column a desperate, visible prayer for survival sent upward into the indifferent, freezing expanse of the winter sky. You watch the frantic, huddled movements of the community members beginning their daily, grueling chores, their heavily bundled forms appearing shapeless and anonymous in the muted early morning light. A heavily laden ox cart rumbles past you on the deeply rutted lane, the massive draft animals blowing enormous plumes of white vapor that temporarily obscure the austere facade of the meeting house. You maintain a careful, measured distance from the exhausted laborers, acknowledging their presence with a curt, minimal nod that requires absolutely no verbal engagement or forced, superficial pleasantries. The profound, unbridgeable gulf between your solitary intellectual existence and their terrified, dogmatic community feels especially vast and impenetrable during these harsh, desperately cold morning hours. You navigate the winding, treacherous path toward the communal storehouse, your mind completely focused on the specific, practical objective of delivering the concentrated willow bark extract to Master Higgins' afflicted wife. The packed snow beneath your feet has transformed into a polished, incredibly dangerous sheet of black ice, requiring intense, calculating concentration to avoid a catastrophic, bone-breaking fall. You pass the blacksmith's open forge, the sudden, violent blast of intense, radiant heat washing briefly over your frozen face before the freezing wind violently snatches the warmth away. The rhythmic, deafening clang of the heavy iron hammer striking the anvil provides a harsh industrial heartbeat for the waking settlement, a sound that completely drowns out the howling of the gale. You press forward with grim, unyielding determination, treating the harsh, punishing elements as a familiar, respectable adversary, rather than a supernatural punishment dispatched by a wrathful, unpredictable deity. You reach the sturdy, weather-beaten door of the Higgins residence, pausing for just a moment to forcefully knock the accumulated, clinging snow from the heavy soles of your leather boots. You rap your knuckles 3 times against the rough timber, the sound dull and flat in the freezing, heavily suppressed atmosphere of the isolated Puritan colony. The door opens with a harsh, agonizing groan of rusted iron hinges, revealing the pale, deeply exhausted face of the storekeeper's eldest daughter, her eyes wide with a mixture of desperate hope and ingrained suspicion. You do not wait for an invitation to cross the heavily guarded threshold, stepping confidently into the incredibly dim, stiflingly hot interior of the crowded, chaotic household. You retrieve the carefully stoppered glass vial from the deep pocket of your heavy winter cloak, holding the precious dark liquid out toward the frightened girl with an aura of absolute, undeniable authority. Shadows dance wildly across the low, soot-blackened ceiling as the massive hearth fire consumes a large, freshly split log of highly resinous pine. You instruct the trembling girl on the precise, meticulous dosage required to alleviate her mother's agonizing joint pain, speaking in a low, even tone that commands immediate, unquestioning obedience. You watch her carefully measure the dark, bitter tincture into a small tin cup of steaming water, your sharp, critical eyes ensuring that absolutely no mistakes are made with the highly potent, carefully extracted medicine. The transaction is completely devoid of warmth or communal affection, a stark, pragmatic exchange of your unparalleled botanical expertise for their continued, begrudging tolerance of your fiercely independent existence. You turn on your heel and exit the stifling, claustrophobic house without waiting for any expressions of gratitude, desperate to return to the clean, biting oxygen of the freezing outdoors. You retrace your steps through the waking, bustling village, the intense, bone-deep exhaustion of the sleepless night finally beginning to aggressively assert its dominance over your heavily taxed nervous system. The massive surge of adrenaline that sustained you through the grueling hours of pitch-black weaving has completely evaporated, leaving your muscles trembling and your joints aching with a dull, persistent fire. You rely entirely on the sturdy hickory walking stick to maintain your upright, unbowed posture, refusing to show a single, microscopic sign of physical weakness to the watchful, incredibly judgmental eyes of the congregation. The pale, watery sunlight fails to penetrate the thick, swirling cloud cover, locking the entire landscape in a state of suspended, monochromatic gloom that perfectly mirrors your own internal, profound weariness. You fix your gaze firmly on the distant, welcoming outline of your isolated timber cottage, treating the small, heavily fortified structure as the ultimate, desperately needed finish line. You finally cross the threshold of your own home, lifting the heavy iron latch and pushing the massive oak door inward with the very last reserves of your depleted, trembling strength. You secure the heavy timber locking bar immediately, a definitive, profoundly satisfying sound that officially seals the hostile, demanding world and all of its frightened inhabitants safely outside. The residual warmth of the banked fire wraps around you like a physical, comforting embrace, a sharp, incredibly welcome contrast to the lethal sub-zero temperatures raging across the cleared fields. You shed your heavy winter cloak and the thick leather apron, letting the garments fall carelessly over the wooden bench as you stumble blindly toward the low, straw-filled mattress. The physical boundaries of the small room begin to blur and swim before your exhausted, burning eyes, the desperate biological need for rest overwhelming your fierce, highly disciplined intellect. Silence reclaims the isolated cottage, a deep, ringing stillness that feels fundamentally different from the tense, hyper-vigilant quiet of the terrifying, howling midnight hours. You sink heavily onto the edge of the bed, your fingers fumbling clumsily with the stiff, freezing leather laces of your heavy boots until they finally yield to your desperate, uncoordinated efforts. You pull the heavy, freshly woven bolt of woolen cloth from the nearby chest, dragging the incredibly dense, lanolin-rich fabric across the mattress to serve as an impenetrable, secondary shield against the invasive cold. The rough, untreated wool scratches pleasantly against your chin, a tangible, physical reminder of the monumental, life-sustaining labor you successfully completed in the absolute, suffocating darkness. You sit perfectly still for a long moment, allowing the profound, undeniable reality of your absolute safety and independence to wash over your deeply fatigued, highly guarded mind. You slowly lower your aching, battered body onto the familiar, rustling surface of the dried bracken, the hard, unyielding mattress feeling suddenly and inexplicably like the most luxurious, welcoming surface on the continent. You pull the heavy layers of woven wool securely up to your chin, trapping the meager, precious heat of your own exhausted body within the tightly constrained, heavily insulated cocoon. You listen to the incredibly faint, rhythmic ticking of the cooling embers in the stone hearth, a sound that has served as your most reliable, constant companion through decades of solitary frontier survival. The howling of the Atlantic wind fades into a dull, indistinguishable murmur beyond the thick timber walls, a distant, irrelevant threat that can no longer reach or harm you in this fiercely defended space. You feel the crushing, accumulated tension of the long, grueling winter slowly begin to drain from your heavily cramped muscles, a highly gradual, agonizingly slow process of physical and mental release. You trace the trajectory of your entire life in this fleeting twilight space between waking and absolute unconsciousness, reflecting on the harsh, uncompromising choices that led you to this specific, isolated room. You chose the terrifying, unpredictable wilderness over the suffocating, highly restricted safety of a Puritan marriage, trading the mandated obedience of a wife for the incredibly dangerous, unparalleled freedom of a solitary healer. You have paid a massive, continuous price for this autonomy, enduring decades of whispered suspicions, profound physical hardship, and the crushing, unbroken weight of complete self-reliance. You do not regret a single, agonizing moment of the grueling journey, finding a deep, unshakable pride in the undisputed fact that you have survived and thrived entirely on your own exacting terms. The darkness waiting behind your heavy, drooping eyelids is not the terrifying void of the deep night, but a warm, highly restorative sanctuary that you have undeniably earned. You focus your fading attention entirely on the incredibly slow, measured rhythm of your own breathing, feeling the freezing, stagnant air enter your lungs and exit in a steady, calming cadence. The physical boundaries of your body seem to slowly dissolve into the heavy, comforting weight of the woolen blankets, merging your exhausted form entirely with the quiet, static architecture of the timber cottage. You release the fierce, ironclad grip on your own hypervigilance, deliberately surrendering your sharp, analytical intellect to the overwhelming biological imperative of profound, uninterrupted rest. The 17th-century world and all of its brutal, demanding realities completely fade from your consciousness, leaving only the incredibly peaceful, unwritten expanse of the quiet, solitary moment. You have outlasted the freezing dark, outmaneuvered the suspicious village, and secured your own survival for yet another day. You close your eyes, rest well tonight. I'll be here when you're ready for another quiet story.